Hey there, fans of the strange, dark, and mysterious. If you're into stories that make your skin crawl and keep you up at night, then buckle up, because this one's a doozy. Delivered in the style you love, true crime, wrapped in eerie details, with a twist that'll leave you questioning everything. This is the story of the Cursed House Mystery on Hilltop Peak. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? This is the deep, dark, and disturbing story of a house, of an inheritance, and of a horrifying truth buried on the very top of a remote, windswept hill. The letter arrived on a cool autumn morning, its envelope thick and embossed with a curious, slightly archaic seal. It was from a law firm announcing that my great-aunt Eleanor had passed away and had, to my complete and utter shock, left her entire estate to me. I had met her maybe twice in my life, a distant, eccentric relative who lived somewhere in the wilds of rural Oregon. The estate included a house, a sprawling, timber-framed structure perched on what the locals called Hilltop Peak. The name alone sounded like something out of a folktale. My first thought was, well, free real estate. And I called my friend Mark, an architect with a flair for old historical buildings. He was immediately on board. The plan was simple: drive up, assess the house, and figure out if we could flip it. The drive took us north, then west, then onto winding, narrow roads that climbed higher and higher into a dense forest of Douglas firs and pines. The light began to fade, and a thick silver fog rolled in, clinging to the branches. The air grew colder, and a profound silence settled over everything. When we finally crested the last hill, the house stood silhouetted against a bruised purple sky. It was magnificent and unsettling at the same time. The structure was enormous, with gables and dormer windows that looked like tired eyes. An old iron gate, half-rusted and vine-choked, marked the entrance. As we stepped out of the car, the silence was total. There were no crickets, no birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of the wind, a low, constant moan that seemed to wrap around the peak itself. The front door was unlocked. We pushed it open, and the smell of dust, old wood, and something else, something damp and earthy, rushed out to greet us. The interior was a time capsule. Furniture was covered in white sheets. Dust motes danced in the last slanting rays of light that pierced the grime-streaked windows. I noticed the floorboards were uneven in places, creaking under our weight with an almost sentient groan. We went from room to room. The living room had a massive stone fireplace. The dining room table was set for one, a single dusty plate and glass sitting in the center. Mark and I exchanged a nervous glance. My great-aunt Eleanor was clearly a peculiar person. Our first night, there was a long one. We set up sleeping bags on the floor of the main bedroom, the one with the biggest window that overlooked a breathtaking, yet somehow menacing, view of the valley below. The wind outside picked up, and every gust seemed to rattle the very bones of the house. I kept hearing things, a faint whisper that I told myself was just the wind, the low groan of the floorboards, as if someone was walking in the hall, a soft clicking sound coming from the wall beside me. Mark, a pragmatist to his core, said it was just an old house settling. "This place is 100 years old, David," he said, pulling his sleeping bag closer. "It's alive, with its own sounds." But the sounds became more specific. The next day, as we were clearing out some of the clutter, I found a small wooden music box on a shelf in the study. I wound it up, and a faint tinny melody tinkled out, a simple lullaby. As it played, I could have sworn I heard a child's laughter, a single, clear peal of joy that echoed somewhere in the house's vast, silent interior. It stopped as soon as the music box did. Over the next few days, we began to uncover more of my aunt's strange life. She had filled the house with an eclectic collection of items. In the library, a whole wall was dedicated to books on local history, folklore, and occult rituals. There were stacks of notebooks everywhere, filled with her meticulous, spidery handwriting. Her notes were an obsessive chronicle of the house itself. She documented every creak, every flicker of light, every unusual sound. She even had charts detailing the moon phases and the weather, all meticulously cross-referenced with what she called the phenomena. My great-aunt, it became clear, was not just eccentric. She was obsessed, maybe even paranoid. The most unnerving thing we found was in the basement. It was a single, heavy oak door, secured with a rusted padlock. "Okay," Mark said, his voice a little strained. "This is getting a bit much. A locked room in the basement of a creepy house? That's a classic horror movie cliché. He laughed, but the sound was thin, lacking its usual heartiness. The door, we discovered from one of her notes, was a room she had sealed herself. Do not enter. The note simply said, its letters scrawled with a heavy, desperate hand. The boundary must not be breached. I was intrigued. Mark was not. He just wanted to get his work done and get out of there. But I couldn't shake the feeling that my aunt had a reason for all of this, for all her bizarre precautions. The house had a story, and I, for some reason, felt a compulsion to hear it. Over the next week, as we worked on the place, the peculiar happenings began to intensify. In the dead of night, I would wake to a low, rhythmic scratching sound coming from the walls, like fingernails tapping on old plaster. I'd stand in the dark, heart pounding, listening to it travel from one end of the room to the other. Mark told me I was sleep deprived and that old houses just did that. One afternoon, I was in the attic, looking through some old furniture, when I saw something in the corner. An old doll with a chipped porcelain face and matted hair. It was sitting upright, propped against a trunk, and when I looked closer, I noticed its eyes were fixed on me. I'm not a particularly superstitious person, but a chill ran down my spine. The last time I was up here, it wasn't there. I know it wasn't. That night, as the wind howled outside, something tapped on my window. I sat bolt upright, my eyes wide. Tap, tap, tap. It was distinct, not the wind. I stared at the glass, seeing nothing but the reflection of the dark room. The tapping stopped. I laid back down, trying to convince myself it was a branch. Then a whispering started. It was faint at first, a sibilant sound, and it seemed to be coming from the floorboards beneath my feet. It sounded like a woman's voice, unintelligible but full of sorrow. I covered my ears, but I could still hear it, seeping into my mind. I looked at Mark, sleeping soundly in his sleeping bag, and a wave of panic hit me. I felt like I was losing my mind, that the house was somehow getting into my head. The next morning, I found what I had been looking for. Tucked away in a false bottom of a wooden chest in the study was a large, leather-bound journal. It was a diary, but its entries were not of daily life. They were a record of my great-aunt's desperate fight. The first entry was dated from when she first moved into the house. It was full of hope and a certain naive wonder about the old place. But as I read on, her tone shifted. The entries began to talk about the presence, a vague, malevolent entity she believed resided on the land itself. She wrote about its voice, a constant low murmur that spoke in her mind, and about the tributes it demanded. I read, completely captivated, as she detailed her attempts to understand and contain the entity. She wrote about the local legends she had uncovered, old tales of people disappearing on Hilltop Peak, of a whispering man who lured travelers to their doom with promises of lost gold or eternal youth. She believed the house was an anchor, a sort of containment vessel for this thing, and she, as the owner, was its keeper. Her entries became more manic, her handwriting more frantic. She described building the sealed room in the basement, not to keep a monster in, but to keep the entity from expanding, to serve as a sort of heart for a ritual she had concocted. The tapping on the walls, the whispering. She had heard it all. She had documented it all. Aunt Eleanor wrote about her failures, about how the entity would sometimes breach her containment, and the bizarre and horrible things that would follow. She mentioned a time when she found a perfectly shaped spiral of twigs on her doorstep, and another when she saw the figure of a small child standing outside her window in the dead of winter, its face distorted and wrong. She was terrified. In her final entries, her sanity was clearly unraveling. She wrote about the terrible feeling of not being alone, of being watched, and the constant, overwhelming weight of the responsibility she had inherited. Her final words, scrawled messily on the last page, were a desperate warning. It needs a new keeper. It's waiting. Don't let it in. Don't let it in. I closed the journal, my hands shaking. The house, all its strange noises and peculiar atmosphere, suddenly made sense. It wasn't a place, it was a prison. And my great-aunt had been its warden. I felt a cold dread wash over me. The whispering I had heard, the tapping, the feeling of being watched. I hadn't imagined it. I went to Mark, but he didn't believe me. He looked at the journal, its scrawled pages, and said, "David, this is just the paranoid ramblings of a lonely old woman." It's sad, not supernatural. He insisted we needed to leave, that the place was getting to me. He was right. It was. But I couldn't just leave. I felt a weird magnetic pull to the basement door, to the sealed room. I had to know what she had kept contained. Late that night, with Mark asleep and the house eerily quiet, I went down to the basement. I held a flashlight, its weak beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. I found a crowbar in the corner and began to pry at the padlock. It was old, and with a terrible grinding sound, it finally broke. The door swung open with a shriek of tortured metal, and a wave of cold air, colder than anything I had ever felt, poured out. The air was thick, heavy, almost suffocating. I shined my light into the room. It wasn't empty. In the center of the room was a simple wooden table, and on it, a small, intricate carving made of intertwined, gnarled roots. Around it were small, personal items, a worn leather glove, a silver locket, a child's toy car. I realized with a sickening jolt that these weren't just objects. They were the tributes she had mentioned in her journal. Around the edges of the room, scratched into the concrete floor, were a series of symbols and sigils. They were meant to contain something, to keep it bound. But as I looked closer, I noticed something else. The symbols were worn away in places, as if they had been repeatedly scuffed and faded. On the far wall, a large section of the intricate markings was completely gone, scratched and scraped away as if by something with long, sharp claws. The boundary had been breached. The door hadn't kept something in, it had kept something out. And now it was inside. I felt a sudden, profound chill. A cold hand seemed to press against the back of my neck. I spun around, my flashlight beam wildly swinging. Nothing was there, but the feeling lingered. I ran from the basement, leaving the door gaping open. The blackness inside, now an open wound in the house's heart. I woke Mark up, my words a frantic jumble. He finally saw the terror in my eyes, the real, raw fear, and he agreed. We had to get out right now. As we scrambled to throw our things into the car, a low, melodic hum began. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a sound that resonated in my very bones. And then came the whispering. It was no longer a vague sound in the distance. It was all around us, coming from the walls, from the attic, from the sealed room in the basement. It wasn't just words, it was my name. David, it breathed, a long, drawn-out syllable that was full of terrible promise. David, don't go. Mark was a whirlwind of panic, pulling bags, trying to start the car. I was frozen. I stood in the middle of the living room, surrounded by the echoes of my great-aunt's life, and listened. I could hear other voices mixed in with the whispering, a cacophony of pleas and warnings, of laughter and sorrow. My great-aunt had been trying to keep the entity from spreading. But she hadn't just been a keeper. She had been a victim. The whispers. They were the voices of all the people who had ever disappeared on Hilltop Peak. They were all part of the entity now, a collective consciousness of suffering and malice. And she was one of them. The final realization hit me like a physical blow. She hadn't left me the house as a gift. She had passed the burden, the curse, to me. She had died, and the responsibility of keeping this malevolent thing contained now fell to me. The entity wasn't a ghost. It wasn't just a monster in the basement. It was the very land itself, the dirt, the trees, the wind that moaned across the peak. The house was merely its anchor, the focal point of its power. And I, as the new owner, was its new guardian. Mark finally got the car started. "Let's go," he screamed. "Now." I stared at him, my mind a churning mess of fear and a horrifying sense of duty. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. "Stay. We need a keeper." It wasn't an evil voice, not really. It was pleading, full of a hollow need. I could feel the entity's tendrils reaching out, coiling around my mind. I could almost understand it now, its profound, bottomless hunger. My great-aunt had written in her journal that she had tried to run. But she had always come back. She had to. The curse was a tether, a chain that bound the new owner to the land until a new one was found. Mark sped down the drive, the tires kicking up gravel, and didn't stop until we were miles away, back on the main road, the fog and the trees now behind us. He looked at me, his face pale and strained. "What was that? What was that thing?" he kept asking. I didn't answer him. I just stared back at the rearview mirror, at the dark, distant outline of hilltop peaks swallowed by the night. I didn't tell him I was already planning on going back. I didn't tell him that I had already accepted my fate. I didn't tell him that I couldn't ignore the whispers that now hummed, faint and constant, in the back of my mind. I was the new keeper, and the cursed house and the dark thing that lived on the peak were now my responsibility. Forever. The old well hiding dark secrets. Today, we are discussing an incident that occurred in the clay belt of northern Ontario. This region is characterized by its isolation, dense spruce forests, and severe winters. The events I will describe took place in a time frame predating modern record-keeping, at a time when remote homesteads operated with minimal outside contact. The central figure in this account is a man identified as Silas. The acquisition and the structure. Silas was a Canadian resident who acquired an isolated property near what is now the location of the defunct community of Cochrane. The land was intended for use as a trapper and logger's homestead. The purchase involved an old, dilapidated farm that had been abandoned for an extended period. A notable and central feature of this property was an old well. This well was a deep structure, hand-dug and lined with timber and earth, sealed by a heavy, worn wooden lid. It was located approximately 20 yards behind the main cabin at the forest's edge. The individual who sold the property through an agent in North Bay simply stated that the well was dry and closed and advised that it was best left alone. Silas intended to permanently seal the well at a later date, prioritizing the necessary repairs to the cabin for his family. He resided there with his wife Lydia and their 2 young children. Lydia reported an immediate sense of unease regarding the well, citing its appearance and the low, hollow sound she sometimes heard emanating from it during calm weather. Silas attributed these sounds to the wind or to her elevated anxiety due to the isolation. Observed phenomena. The initial reported anomaly occurred on a Tuesday afternoon during late fall. Lydia was inside the cabin with the children asleep. She reported a sudden, sharp drop in ambient temperature within the kitchen area. Upon investigation, she observed a dark, oily smudge of water on the wooden floor near the back door. The substance was extremely cold and had an odor described as a combination of stagnant water and wet earth. While cleaning the smudge, she heard a sound from outside the back door. It was identified as a woman's voice, which distinctly called her name, Lydia. The voice was described as thin and conveying a sense of profound sorrow. Upon immediately checking outside, no person or source for the sound was visible. The well was noted to be silent and sealed. A separate incident was reported by Silas concerning a piece of equipment. A heavy, iron-headed felling axe, which he confirmed he had left outside near the chimney on a Saturday evening before a snow event, was discovered to be missing the following morning. Despite an extensive search of the property, the axe could not be located. Approximately 1 week later, following a significant snowfall, Silas located the axe lying partially buried in the new snow immediately adjacent to the well's timbers. The snow surrounding the well, however, showed no signs of disturbance, such as footprints or drag marks. The axe exhibited a temperature lower than the environment, and its blade was coated with a dark substance that possessed a sickly metallic smell consistent with oxidized material. This observation led Silas to develop a suspicion regarding the history of the well. The incident. This suspicion escalated into a search on a Tuesday night during a severe blizzard. The children, Liam and Emily, had repeatedly woken up earlier in the evening, reporting a bad lady singing outside their window. At approximately 3:30 in the morning, Silas was awakened by a loud, reverberating thud originating from outside the structure. He identified the noise as the sound of the heavy wooden cap being dislodged from the well opening. The cap was found tipped over in the snow, and the securing chain was taut and strained. Upon approaching the open well, a sound was heard ascending from the dark shaft. It was described as a choking, gurgling plea. The light from the moon faintly illuminated the interior, revealing an object 10 feet down on the iced timber lining, his wife's wedding ring. Silas then retrieved a rope and a lantern. Upon lowering the lantern, a strong odor of rot, iron, and ancient organic material emanated from the shaft. The light revealed the bottom of the well, occupied by a pool of dark, oily water. Submerged beneath the water's surface, a skeletal form was observed, slick with moisture and embedded in the clay. The skull was oriented upward, facing the light source. The skeleton had his felling axe entangled in the residual fabric around its neck area. As the lantern light began to fail, the air temperature above the well was noted to drop significantly. Silas reported feeling 2 small icy points of contact on his ankles, though he observed nothing physically present. He subsequently dropped the lantern, which shattered upon impacting the water's surface. Prior to this, the light briefly illuminated a pale white face with wide eyes that appeared to rise up from the water. The final audible sound reported by Silas before retreating from the well was the low, reedy voice, now positioned close to his ear, stating, "You promised you would seal me up." Conclusion. Following the conclusion of the blizzard, a neighboring resident initiated a welfare check. The property was found to be abandoned. The official investigation reported that Silas, Lydia, Liam, and Emily were absent. There was no evidence of forced entry or struggle. The well cap was discovered to be replaced and secured over the opening. Examination of the wooden underside of the cap revealed a new, deeply scored mark shaped like the name Silas. The well was subsequently filled with concrete by provincial authorities. Local residents in the nearby logging communities continue to mention the location, reporting that during cold, calm nights, a faint, sad sound can be heard at the site, consistent with a woman gurgling a song from below the ground. This account details the disappearance of a Canadian family linked to the structure known as the Old Well near Cochrane, Ontario, and the unexplained details associated with the location. Thick fog, concealing the horror house. This is a story about a young man named Alex Finch and a house on the moors, a house that was swallowed whole by a relentless, unnatural fog. It's a story that begins with a simple, unexpected inheritance, but ends with a chilling question: what happens when a place doesn't just hold secrets, but actively traps them inside a permanent shroud of mist? Alex Finch was a practical man. 26 years old, living in a cramped flat in South London. He spent his days as a graphic designer, his nights watching films, and occasionally nursing a pint with his mates. He was the kind of person who believed in logic and reason, in things that could be seen and touched and explained. Ghosts were for Hollywood films, ancient curses were for dusty books. So when a solicitor's letter arrived, bearing the crest of a firm he didn't recognize, he was more curious than concerned. The letter informed him of the death of a distant relative he had never met, a reclusive great-aunt named Alara Holloway. And, to his complete surprise, it declared him the sole beneficiary of her entire estate. That estate, as it turned out, consisted of one single asset, a large, isolated property known as Holloway Hall, located deep within a remote stretch of moorland in the north of England. The solicitor was clear, almost unsettlingly so, that the house was in a state of disrepair and had not been lived in for many years. Alex's first thought was to sell it, to use the money to pay off his debts and put a down payment on a place of his own in the city. He saw it as a straightforward transaction, a stroke of financial luck. What he didn't realize was that he was about to enter a transaction of a very different kind. The journey north was a long one. He took the train as far as he could, then hired a car. The familiar urban sprawl of London gave way to the rolling green hills of the Midlands, and eventually to the stark, wild beauty of the northern moors. The landscape was breathtaking in its bleakness, a vast, empty expanse of heather and grass, punctuated by jagged outcrops of rock. As he drove further, the roads became narrower, twisting and turning with a disorienting familiarity. The GPS signal grew weak, then disappeared entirely. He had to rely on a printed map, its lines and symbols feeling more and more antiquated with every passing mile. He passed through the village of Gritstone, a collection of grey stone cottages huddled together against the biting wind. He stopped at a small, dimly lit pub to ask for directions. The pub was called The Winding Path, and it was almost empty save for a few old men nursing pints of ale and staring into the flickering fireplace. The landlord, a stooped man with a weathered face named Mr. Davies, looked up as Alex entered. When Alex mentioned Holloway Hall, the room fell silent. The old men at the fire shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Mr. Davies wiped a glass slowly, his eyes fixed on Alex's. "That's a place best left alone, lad," he said, his voice a low rumble. "People, They don't go up there much. Haven't for a long time. Alex, ever the pragmatist, brushed off the warning with a wry smile. It's a long drive, Mr. Davies. I just need to get there. It's in my family. Mr. Davies sighed, a sound like wind over a moorland stone. Aye, it's in your family, and it'll want to keep you. He then gave Alex directions, but his eyes held a profound sadness and something else, something like fear, that Alex couldn't quite place. As he left the pub, he felt the heavy silence of the place following him out the door. The last leg of the journey was the worst. The tarmac road gave way to a rough gravel track, and then to a barely visible pair of ruts carved into the moorland grass. The sun was beginning to set, and the light was fading fast. That's when the fog started. It didn't roll in from the horizon like a natural fog. It simply appeared as if the air itself was thickening, congealing into a milky white substance. It was unnaturally dense, swallowing the headlights of the car and reducing visibility to mere feet. It smelled of damp earth and something else. Something cold and metallic, like old coins. It was like driving through a silent, suffocating cloud. He could no longer see the distant hills or even the vague shape of the moorland around him. He was completely alone, enclosed within a bubble of white. Just as he was about to give up and turn back, the pale, spectral shape of a house appeared before him. It was a massive 3-story structure of dark, unyielding stone. Its windows were like black, empty eyes staring out from a gaunt face. Holloway Hall. The fog seemed to press in on it, clinging to the gables and roof, making it look as if the house was exhaling a permanent breath of white. He parked the car, its engine ticking in the eerie silence, and got out. The fog was thick, cold, and wet on his skin. It muted every sound, making the world feel distant and unreal. The only sounds were the soft, heavy drip of condensation from the eaves of the house and the hollow thud of his own boots on the gravel path. He found the key hidden beneath a stone as instructed in the solicitor's letter. The lock was stiff and rusted, but it eventually turned with a groan that seemed to echo through the very foundations of the place. He pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped inside. The air was colder here, even colder than the fog outside, and it smelled of decay and dust and something he couldn't name. He fumbled for his phone's torch and cast a beam of light into the darkness. The hall was large and cavernous, a grand staircase sweeping up into the gloom. The furniture was all draped in white sheets, like silent, skeletal ghosts. As he stood there, a whisper seemed to slither through the air, a faint, almost inaudible sound that raised the hairs on his arms. He told himself it was just the wind, the old house settling. He had to be logical. He spent the first night trying to make the house feel more like his. He found the fuse box and managed to get a few lights working, a pale, anemic glow that did little to dispel the shadows. He ate a cold sandwich he had brought with him, the bread feeling stale in his mouth. He unrolled his sleeping bag in the dusty sitting room, wrapping himself in it like a cocoon against the bone-deep cold. He was too tired to be frightened. He just wanted to sleep. That's when he heard the music. It was a faint, tinkling melody, like a music box playing a lullaby. It came from the floor above him, a sweet, innocent sound that was completely out of place in this old, decaying house. He sat up, his heart thumping against his ribs. The tune was slow and deliberate, a simple, repetitive melody that seemed to wind its way through the very walls of the hall. He told himself it was the wind, but the tune was too perfect, too structured. It stopped as abruptly as it began, plunging the house back into a suffocating silence. He lay there for a long time, listening to the silence, until exhaustion finally pulled him down into a fitful, dreamless sleep. The next morning, the fog was even thicker. He couldn't see past the front gate. The car was now a blurry, indistinct shape a few yards away. The world outside the house had ceased to exist. He tried the front door, but it was stiff, almost as if it had been sealed shut. He tried the windows, but they were painted over and wouldn't budge. He felt a flicker of anxiety, a cold little knot in his stomach. He was trapped. He tried to tell himself it was just the damp, that the wood had swollen, but a deeper, more primal part of him knew better. The fog wasn't just weather, it was a barricade. He spent the day exploring the house. The ground floor was a labyrinth of empty rooms, each one colder and more desolate than the last. He found a study with a rotting desk, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust. He found a dining room with a long mahogany table, its chairs pushed back as if a family had just risen from a meal a century ago. The air was heavy, as if the past had congealed into a tangible presence. The unsettling whispers from the night before were gone, replaced by a low, constant hum, a vibration that seemed to come from deep within the house itself. He ascended the grand staircase, its wooden banister slick with a cold, greasy film. The second floor was where the horror began to truly manifest. In a small bedroom, he found a child's rocking horse, still and silent in the center of the room. A doll was propped up on a small chair, its glass eyes staring unblinkingly at him. It wasn't the objects themselves that were terrifying. It was the feeling that they had been placed there deliberately recently. The dust on the floor was disturbed, as if someone had walked there just moments before he arrived. He found the source of the music box melody in the next room. It was on a dusty chest of drawers, a small wooden box with a delicate porcelain ballerina on top. He picked it up. It felt impossibly cold. He turned the key on the back. A small, sad tune began to play, the same lullaby he had heard the night before. But as it played, he noticed something horrifying. The ballerina was not twirling. Her little head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and her hands were clasped over her eyes, as if she was trying to block out some terrible sight. A quiet, dry rattle came from within the box, as if tiny bones were shaking loose. He dropped it with a cry of disgust, and it clattered to the floor, the music stopping with an abrupt, discordant clink. He ran from the room, his heart pounding, his logical mind shattered. This wasn't just an old house with a story. There was something here, something malevolent and present. He tried to go back downstairs, to find a way out, any way out. But as he reached the landing, he saw it. The hallway stretched before him, but it was no longer a simple hallway. The walls seemed to pulse, to breathe, and the air had grown heavy with a scent like old dried blood. In the far distance, a figure stood at the end of the hall. It was the shadowy outline of a woman. She was dressed in a long, dark dress, and she was standing perfectly still, her head bowed. But as he watched, her head slowly tilted up, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that she was looking directly at him. Her face was obscured by the shadows, but he could feel her gaze, a cold, hungry weight on his very soul. He stumbled backwards, a soundless scream lodged in his throat, and ran. He found a door and threw it open, stumbling into a room he hadn't seen before. It was a study, but this one was different. It felt personal. A large portrait hung on the wall, and by the light of his phone, he saw the face of the great aunt Alara. She was a stern-looking woman, her eyes dark and piercing, her mouth a grim, thin line. On a small table beneath the portrait, he saw a leather-bound journal. He snatched it up, his hands shaking, and began to read. The journal was a record of Alara's life in the house. The entries were dated, but he ignored them, scanning for the horror he knew was there. She wrote of her parents, the original owners of the house, and their descent into madness. She wrote of a deep, sorrowful fog that had trapped them. She called it the breathing fog. She wrote of its presence, a living entity that grew stronger with their fear. Her parents, she wrote, had made a terrible pact, a desperate bargain with whatever entity resided in the house to keep the fog away. They had failed. The journal became more frantic, the handwriting spidery and almost illegible. She wrote of whispers in the walls, of shadows that moved when she wasn't looking. She wrote of her brother's disappearance. The last entry was chilling in its simplicity. The fog will keep me, and I will keep the others. It is all that we are now. A sound made him look up, a scratching. It was coming from the floorboards directly beneath his feet. He could hear it now, a rhythmic, maddening scratch, scratch, scratch. He knew what it was. It was a fingernail, a person trying to claw their way out from beneath the floorboards. The sound was too precise, too deliberate to be anything else. He backed away from the desk, his eyes darting to the portrait of Alara on the wall. Her grim smile seemed to have widened, her dark eyes now holding a malevolent glint. He had come here for a house, but what he had inherited was a prison. He ran back to the staircase, his mind a whirlwind of terror. He had to get out, had to get back to the car. He had to escape the house, the fog, the whispers, the scratching, the spectral woman, the whole terrible, suffocating place. He reached the front door and threw his weight against it. It didn't budge. He tried the windows, slamming his body against the thick panes of glass. They were like solid sheets of unbreakable ice. He was trapped, and the house knew it. He could feel it now, an almost palpable sense of glee, a low, triumphant hum vibrating through the walls. He slumped against the wall, defeated, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The scratching from the floorboards was getting louder, more insistent, as if whatever was down there was getting closer to the surface. He felt a cold breath on the back of his neck, and a voice, a hollow, dry whisper like rustling leaves, spoke directly into his ear. "Welcome home, Alex Finch. You're part of the family now." He turned, but there was nothing there, just the cold, oppressive stillness. He knew then that the house hadn't just been waiting for an owner, it had been waiting for a new resident. The fog outside was not a natural phenomenon, but a living, breathing barrier, a permanent shroud created by the house itself to keep its secrets inside. The horror wasn't something that had happened a long time ago. It was something that was still happening, and it would continue to happen forever. A constant, repeating cycle of fear, isolation, and despair. He stumbled through the house, his mind breaking down, his logic no longer able to hold the madness at bay. He went to the kitchen and found the tap. He turned it on, hoping for a cup of water, a simple human comfort. But the water that trickled out was not clear. It was a thick, brown liquid, and as he watched, a long, dark hair, thin as a spider's web, floated to the surface. He dropped the glass, and it shattered on the floor. He heard a child's mournful laugh coming from the room above. Alex Finch never left Holloway Hall. The story, as it's told by Mr. Davies at the pub in Gritstone, is that he simply disappeared. A few weeks after Alex's car was found abandoned on the moor, the police came to investigate. They found the house completely silent, utterly empty. The fog, they said, was the thickest they had ever seen. They couldn't get a clear look at the place. And so, the mystery of Holloway Hall and the lost resident named Alex Finch simply became another ghost story whispered over pints in the winding path. A story about a man who inherited a house, but ended up inheriting something far, far worse. And to this day, when the winds are still and the air is heavy with moisture, the breathing fog still descends upon the moor, shrouding the secrets of Holloway Hall. And the souls it holds within forever. Traces of sadistic living room murder. This is a story about a family, a house in a quiet suburban cul-de-sac, and the terrible, silent history of a single room. It's a story that asks a chilling question. When a horrific act is committed, does the memory of it linger in the very air, waiting to be felt by the next person who stands on that spot? His name was Julian Price. A young professional in his early 30s, a Londoner by birth, Julian was looking for a new start. He had just gone through a messy breakup and was in desperate need of a change of scenery. He worked in finance and spent his days staring at spreadsheets, so the idea of buying a small, quiet house in a commuter town outside the city seemed like a welcome escape. He found the perfect place on an online listing, a detached, two-story house in the seemingly peaceful town of Chiltern, a short train ride from London. It was a bargain, a ridiculously low price for the area, and the listing mentioned it was a distressed property sold as part of a probate sale. Julian, ever the pragmatist, assumed this meant the previous owner had passed away and the heirs just wanted to get rid of it quickly. He saw a project, a chance to renovate and make a profit. What he didn't see was the history he was buying into. The house was on a street called Willow Creek Lane, a neat row of identical brick homes with manicured lawns. Everything about it looked normal, from the tidy front gardens to the cars parked in the driveways. The house itself was unassuming, a classic red brick design with a bay window and a small porch. It was just a house. When he first went to see it on a bright sunny afternoon, he was with the estate agent, a cheerful woman named Miss Finch. She chattered about the excellent schools and the local amenities, but Julian barely listened. He was busy doing a mental calculation of the renovation costs. The house was dusty and smelled faintly of mothballs and old wood, but that was to be expected. The only oddity he noticed was in the living room. The living room was large, with a set of French doors leading out to the back garden. The carpet had been ripped up, leaving the bare floorboards exposed. But on one particular spot, in the center of the room, there was a dark, almost black stain on the wood. It was an oval shape, about a meter long, and it looked like a shadow. A permanent shadow. Julian pointed it out to Miss Finch, who quickly laughed it off. "Oh, that old thing," she said with a dismissive wave. "The previous owner's dog, I think, had a little accident. We'll get that taken care of for you before you move in." Julian accepted the explanation, a little too readily. He didn't think about it again until the day he got the keys. He moved in on a damp, gray Tuesday afternoon. The promised work on the floor hadn't been done, and the dark stain was still there, an unblinking dark eye in the middle of his living room. He decided he would deal with it himself later, perhaps by sanding the floor and replacing the boards. That night, he ordered a pizza, sat on the floor, and began to feel off. It was a strange, subtle feeling. Not a feeling of being watched, but a feeling of intense sadness. He felt a profound sense of despair, as if a great weight had settled on his chest. It was the feeling you get when you've just heard terrible news, a cold, heavy ache that has no apparent cause. He told himself it was just the stress of the move, the loneliness of being in a new, empty house. He finished his pizza and went to bed. The feeling of sadness returned every time he entered the living room. It was always strongest in the late afternoon as the light began to fade. He started to avoid the room entirely, opting to spend his evenings in the small study instead, poring over design ideas for the renovations. He decided to start with the living room to get rid of the floor and its unsettling stain once and for all. He bought a sander, a new set of floorboards, and a large can of sealant. The morning he began the work, the weather was grim, with a light, persistent drizzle tapping against the windows. The gloom outside seemed to amplify the feeling in the room. As he set up the sander, he noticed something about the stain he hadn't seen before. It wasn't just a stain on the surface. The wood was soaked through, the grain itself was dark and saturated. It was as if something had been spilled there, something thick and dark. He put on his headphones and started the sander, the loud hum of the machine, a welcome distraction. He sanded for hours, the air filling with the fine dust of old wood. The stain, however, didn't lighten. It seemed to grow darker, more defiant, as if refusing to be erased. He tried to sand more aggressively, pushing down on the machine, but it was no use. The dark mark remained, a permanent scar on the face of the wood. Frustrated, he decided to replace the floorboards entirely. He found a crowbar and started to pry up the planks around the stain. They came up easily, old and brittle. When he got to the planks with the stain, however, they were different. They were fused to the joists beneath as if they had been glued down with a strange, sticky substance. He had to use all his strength to tear them up, the wood splintering and protesting with a long, drawn-out shriek. As he pulled up the last of the stained boards, a rank, metallic smell filled the air. It was the smell of old, dried blood. And then he saw it. The joists beneath the floorboards were splattered with the same dark black substance. It wasn't just on the surface, it had soaked into the very foundation of the room. He felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't a dog, this was something else entirely. As he stood there, frozen, he noticed something else. Something small and glinting in the dark space between the joists. He knelt down and reached into the dust and decay and pulled out a small, tarnished silver locket. It was a child's locket. He opened it, and inside was a faded, smiling photograph of a little girl no older than 5, with blonde pigtails and a toothy grin. He sat back on his heels, the smell of blood filling his nostrils, the photograph of the little girl staring up at him, her smile a cruel, innocent mockery. The feeling of sadness that had been with him since he moved in suddenly intensified, turning into a profound, gut-wrenching grief. He felt a rush of emotions that weren't his own: fear, panic, and an overwhelming sense of helplessness. He knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that he was feeling the last moments of a life, the life of a child. Julian, now terrified and desperate for answers, went to the local library. The librarian, a kind elderly woman named Mrs. Graham, helped him access the town's historical archives. He found what he was looking for in a stack of old newspapers, their pages yellowed and brittle with age, an article from 10 years prior, a headline in bold, black letters, "Local man arrested for brutal murder of family." The article detailed the chilling story of Arthur Holloway, the previous owner of the house on Willow Creek Lane. The story was a local legend, a whisper in the quiet community, and it had been kept out of the official records for the most part to protect the victim's privacy. It said that Arthur, a seemingly normal family man, had committed a heinous act of domestic violence. He had murdered his wife and their young daughter in the living room in the exact spot where the dark stain was. The article described the scene in vague clinical terms, mentioning the sadistic nature of the crime. The police found the bodies in the living room, but the little girl's body was never recovered. The police believed Arthur had disposed of it somewhere on the property. He had confessed to the crime and was now serving a life sentence in prison. The little girl's name was Lily. Her body was never found. Julian looked at the photograph in the locket, the smiling face of the little girl with the blonde pigtails, and felt a wave of cold dread. She was still here. Somewhere. Trapped? He drove to the prison the next day. He had to see Arthur. He had to know what happened. He sat in the visiting room, the air thick with an oppressive silence. Arthur Holloway was a gaunt, pale man with dead eyes. He was nothing like the happy family man in the old photographs. He looked at Julian with an expression of cold indifference. Julian explained who he was, that he now owned the house. Arthur just stared at him, a faint, cruel smile playing on his lips. "The stain?" Julian said, his voice trembling slightly. "The stain on the floor. I know what it is. I know what you did." Arthur's smile widened. It was the smile of a snake. "You don't know anything," he rasped, his voice a dry, papery sound. "That wasn't the first stain, and it won't be the last. The house, it likes it. It wants it. The house is hungry. You think you're in a new home? You're in a museum, a gallery of my greatest work." He leaned forward, his eyes burning with a manic light. "The little one. She didn't want to leave. She's still there, isn't she? Just a little lost girl, trying to find her way home." Julian left the prison and drove back to the house in a daze. His heart was a drum in his chest, his mind a whirlwind of fear and disbelief. He was no longer just a homeowner. He was a caretaker, a custodian of a living, breathing crime scene. He went straight to the living room, the smell of dust and old blood filling his nostrils. The floorboards were still ripped up, the dark stain on the joists, a gaping, malevolent wound. He felt the profound sadness again, but this time it was different. It was no longer just sadness. It was the presence of a terrified child, a little girl who was forever looking for her family. He stood in the center of the room, on the spot where the crime had been committed, and felt the air grow cold. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of his own shaky breath. And then he heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible sound, like a child's whisper. "Where are you, Daddy?" Julian stumbled back, his eyes wide with horror. The words were not in his head, they were in the room. He felt the cold air rush past him, a small, tiny gust of wind that didn't come from a window or a door. He felt a small, cold hand brush against his ankle. He looked down, but there was nothing there. Just the empty space where the floorboards had been, the dark stain on the wood, a silent witness to a terrible crime. He knew he had to leave, had to get out, but he also knew that he couldn't. He couldn't leave Lily alone. He spent the next few weeks trying to find Lily. He dug up the garden, he searched the attic, he scoured the basement, his mind consumed by a feverish need to find her body and give her a proper burial. He didn't sleep, he didn't eat. He was a ghost in his own house, haunted by a child who was not a ghost at all, but a trapped soul. He would sit in the living room, in the spot where the crime had been committed, and he would feel her presence. He felt her fear, her confusion, her profound, heartbreaking sadness. He would talk to her, his voice a hushed whisper in the silent house. "Lily," he would say, "I'm going to find you. I'm going to help you." But he never found her. Instead, the house began to change him. The sadness became a part of him. He would wake up in the middle of the night, sobbing for a child he had never known. The whispers became more frequent, more insistent. "I want to go home," a child's voice would say. "Where's my dolly?" One night, Julian was sitting in the living room, surrounded by the mess of his failed renovations. He felt a small, cold hand take his own. He looked up and he saw her. She was not a shadowy figure or a wispy apparition. She was a little girl standing in the center of the room, her small, pale face looking up at him with immense sadness. She was wearing a tattered, old-fashioned dress, and her blonde pigtails were messy and dirty. She was transparent, a faint outline against the gloom, but she was there, as real as the floorboards he was sitting on. "I can't find my daddy," she said, her voice a fragile whisper. "He's gone." Julian's heart broke. He knew what she meant. Her father was in prison, but her spirit, her essence, was still trapped here. "Lily," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I'm gonna find you a new home. I promise." She smiled, a sad, knowing smile, and then she was gone, a wisp of cold air. Julian went back to work with a new sense of purpose. He would finish the renovations. He would make the house beautiful again. He would find a new family for it, a family with a little girl who would bring joy and light back into the place. He would break the cycle. He would free Lily. He spent the next few months working tirelessly, his body driven by an almost manic energy. He replaced the floorboards, he repainted the walls, he cleaned away the dust and the grime. He put a new carpet down in the living room, a thick, plush rug that completely covered the dark stain on the floorboards beneath. He had done everything he could to erase the memory of the crime, to make the house a home again. He felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. He put the house back on the market at a fair price this time. He received an offer almost immediately from a young family with a daughter. Julian was happy for them. He had done his part. He had made the house a home again. He was packing up the last of his things, a few boxes of his belongings, when he felt the old familiar coldness. The air in the living room seemed to grow thick and heavy. He heard a whisper. "He lied," the little girl's voice said. "He's not a new daddy, he's just a new man. He wants to hurt me." Julian stopped, his heart in his throat. He went to the window and saw a car pull up outside. A man got out, a young man, a handsome man, and he was smiling. He opened the passenger door, and a little girl with blonde pigtails and a toothy grin hopped out of the car, laughing. She was about the same age as Lily had been. Julian watched in horror as the little girl ran up the path, her laughter a joyous, beautiful sound. She stopped just before the front door and looked up at the house, and then she stopped laughing. Her smile slowly faded from her face. She looked at the house with wide, frightened eyes, and she looked straight at Julian. He could feel her fear, her terror, as if it were his own. He saw her point a small, trembling finger at the living room window, at him. "Mommy," she said, her voice a small, terrified whisper. "That man. He's crying." Julian watched, tears streaming down his face, as the mother came to the front door, her face a mask of concern. "What is it, sweetie?" she asked. The mother followed her daughter's gaze, but she couldn't see him. Julian knew then, with a chilling certainty, that the horror hadn't ended. He hadn't broken the cycle. He had just become a part of it. The house, the stain, the sadness, the fear. It was all still there, waiting for the next person to feel it. The living room was a stage, and the tragedy was destined to be replayed over and over again for as long as the house stood. And he, Julian Price, was its newest and most tormented audience. Patient 13 mysteriously vanished. This is a story about a place, a man of science, and a patient who understood that some things in this world cannot be explained. It's a story about a disappearance, a locked room, and the chilling question of whether some people are not lost, but simply erased. Dr. Eris Thorne was a man of reason. He had trained at some of the best medical schools on the East Coast, his mind a steel trap for logic, his beliefs rooted in the tangible world of anatomy and psychology. He had come to the Whitaker Sanatorium not for a grand salary, but for the challenge. The sanatorium was a private, highly regarded psychiatric facility located in the isolated, snow-covered mountains of Colorado. It was a place of last resort, a quiet campus of stone buildings where the most complex and difficult cases were sent for specialized care. The solitude was a feature, not a bug. It was a place for healing, free from the distractions of the outside world, or so Aris believed. His first 6 months at Whitaker were exactly what he expected. Long days, complex case studies, and the rewarding, if sometimes slow, process of helping patients find their way back to themselves. The facility was old, a collection of repurposed stone structures built in the early 1900s. It had a history as a tuberculosis sanatorium, a detail that was often mentioned with a kind of grim reverence by the senior staff. The air was thin and crisp, and the deep winter snowdrifts often made the roads impassable for days at a time. It was during one of these relentless snowstorms, a blizzard that had buried the entire valley, that patient 13 was admitted. His name was Elias Vance. He was not a typical patient. There was no mania, no debilitating depression, no paranoid delusions. Elias was calm, articulate, and intelligent. He spoke with a quiet, unsettling certainty that made you want to lean in to listen closer. His intake notes were simple. He had been found wandering near an abandoned mining town, malnourished but otherwise unharmed. He claimed he had been there for weeks, but the local authorities were baffled. His file simply noted a unique delusional disorder, a diagnosis so vague it was almost meaningless. Aris was intrigued. He took Elias on as his personal case. Their first session was held in Aris's office, a small wood-paneled room on the second floor of the main building. The snow was falling outside in thick, heavy flakes, coating the world in a blanket of white silence. Aris started with the basic questions, the standard psychiatric assessment. Elias answered them with a disarming honesty. He spoke of his childhood, his education, his past jobs. Everything was normal, almost boring. Aris was puzzled. "Elias," Aris finally said, his voice soft and non-confrontational, "your file notes that you have a specific kind of delusional disorder. Can you tell me what you believe you see?" Elias smiled faintly, a sad, knowing expression that seemed too old for his face. "I don't believe I see anything, doctor. I know what I see. I see echoes, residuals, the remnants of terrible moments, moments of great suffering. Places, they remember things, you see. They hold on to them. The emotions, the pain, the fear." Aris was patient. He had heard variations of this before, a form of psychosis where a person's brain creates a narrative to explain a perceived trauma. "And what have you seen here, Elias? In this place?" Elias looked around the office, his eyes lingering on the wooden desk, the bookshelves, the deep green armchair. "Oh, this place! This place is screaming, doctor! Right now!" "You just can't hear it. The walls are thick with it." He paused, his gaze fixing on a spot just above Aris's left shoulder. His eyes went wide, and his body tensed. He was right there, in that corner, begging. The man in the black coat, he just kept shaking his head, over and over, no matter how much he begged. Aris wrote in his notepad a clinical note, patient describing visual and auditory hallucinations related to his delusional state. He then changed the subject, redirecting Elias to a different topic, but as the session ended, Elias turned to him, his eyes filled with an unbearable sadness. "This place remembers everything, doctor," he said, his voice a whisper. "And it's about to wake up." Over the next 2 weeks, the blizzard raged on, a perpetual white fury. The sanatorium was completely cut off, a self-contained island in a sea of snow. Elias was a model patient. He ate his meals, followed his routine, and spoke to Aris every day. But his delusions became more specific, more chilling. He started telling Aris about a hidden wing of the hospital, an old annex that had been sealed off decades ago. He spoke of the experiments. "The doctor," Elias said one afternoon, his voice low and intense. "The one they called the architect of pain. He was a man of science, like you, Dr. Thorne. He believed that the mind could be broken down and rebuilt. He used certain methods, terrible methods, and they all happened down in the South Wing, in the old sanitarium's surgical suites. They say he disappeared. They say he just vanished." Aris tried to find records of this, but the sanatorium's official history was a sanitized, cheerful document. The South Wing was sealed, as Elias had said, due to structural instability. Aris's logical mind told him it was all a fabrication, a complex and intricate delusion, but a small, cold knot of unease had begun to form in his stomach. Elias was describing a level of detail that would be impossible to invent. He knew about the hidden sub-basement, the old coal furnace that had long since been shut down, the faint smell of iodine that still clung to the South Wing's entrance. One morning, Elias refused to get out of bed. His eyes were wide with a terror Aris had never seen before. "He's here, doctor," Elias said, his voice barely audible. "He's been waiting. He's been feeding on all the pain in this place for 100 years, and now he's coming for me. I'm patient 13. Aris tried to reassure him, to calm him down, but Elias just kept repeating it, his eyes fixed on some unseen horror in the corner of his room. Aris was forced to place him on a sedative. He felt a deep, profound sadness for his patient. Elias was a good man, suffering from a terrible illness. Aris was determined to help him. He would find a way. He would prove his own sanity and Elias's illness, a tangible physical sickness that could be explained and treated. That night, the snowstorm reached its peak. The wind howled outside, a constant, mournful wail that shook the old stone buildings to their foundations. The sanatorium staff was on high alert. The lights flickered, a constant, anxiety-inducing strobe. Aris, unable to sleep, was in his office, poring over old hospital records he had managed to find in a forgotten file cabinet. He was looking for any mention of a doctor with a cruel nickname, of any experiments, of any unsolved disappearances. He found nothing. At precisely 2 in the morning, a young nurse named Amelia knocked on his door. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, with a fear he had seen only on the faces of his most disturbed patients. "Dr. Thorne," she said, her voice a tremor. "You need to come with me. It's patient 13. Aris followed her, his heart pounding in his chest. They went down a long, dimly lit corridor to the secure ward. The air grew colder, and the flickering lights cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. When they reached Elias's room, a small group of staff was already gathered outside, their faces a mixture of confusion and disbelief. The room was locked from the outside. The steel door was still bolted shut, but when the head nurse, Miss Jenkins, unlocked it and they all went in, they found it empty. Elias Vance was gone. The room was a classic psychiatric hold room. It had no windows, only a small, reinforced ventilation vent near the ceiling. The walls were padded, the bed was bolted to the floor. The steel door was the only way in or out. There was no sign of a struggle, no broken bed frame, no scuff marks on the padded walls, no torn clothing, no sign of forced entry. The room was pristine. It was as if Elias had simply ceased to exist. He had vanished. The next morning, the police were called, but the roads were still impassable. The investigation fell to the staff. They searched the entire facility, the grounds, the nearby woods, the basements, and the attics. There was no trace. The head of the sanatorium, a pragmatic and deeply religious man named Mr. Abernathy, called it a miracle, a bad one. He said it was a spiritual disappearance, a demonic manifestation. Aris, his mind reeling, knew it was something else. His scientific mind refused to accept the impossible. He had to find a logical explanation. He returned to Elias's room. He sat on the empty, bolted bed, his mind a frantic scramble of hypotheses. A secret tunnel? No, the foundations were solid. A staff member? But why? And how? The nurses and orderlies were all accounted for and had alibis. The only conclusion was the impossible one. Elias had disappeared from a locked, sealed room with no physical way out. Aris went to Elias's file. He found the journals he had been given to write in. The last entry was dated the night before. The handwriting was shaky, but the words were clear. "He's coming for me. He promised. He promised to show me how. He said I would be the last one." Aris reread the sentence, his blood running cold. The last one. This wasn't a delusion. This was an invitation. Aris went to the sanatorium's archives, a dusty, forgotten room in the basement. He found old blueprints, yellowed and brittle with age. He found the south wing. It wasn't condemned. It had been sealed. The blueprints showed a series of subterranean tunnels, a network of corridors and storage rooms beneath the main building. And they led directly to a hidden sub-basement, an unlisted space directly beneath the south wing. A space that was not on the official records. Aris found the entrance to the sealed wing in the boiler room. It was an old steel door, rusted shut, with a padlock that looked 100 years old. The sanatorium staff had never been in there. It was considered a historical relic. But Aris, with a growing sense of dread, knew that Elias had been in there, and he knew how to get in. He had to find a way in. He found an old bolt cutter and, with a grim determination, broke the padlock. The door groaned open with a metallic shriek, revealing a long, dark corridor. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, rust, and something else. Something sickly sweet, like decaying formaldehyde. Aris pulled out his phone's flashlight and stepped inside. He had to know. He had to know what happened to patient 13. He walked for what felt like miles, his boots crunching on the dusty concrete floor. He passed rusted gurneys, old surgical instruments, and sealed doors. The walls were covered in a thick black mold that seemed to writhe in the beam of his light. He felt a profound sense of sadness, a crushing weight of despair that was not his own. It was a residual, an echo. Elias had been right. This place was screaming. He found a small handwritten sign on a door that read, Dr. Finch's private study. The name sent a jolt of cold fear through him. Finch, the architect of pain. The doctor from Elias's stories. The one who had also mysteriously vanished. He pushed the door open. The room was a small office, dominated by an old desk. On the desk was a leather-bound journal. He opened it, his hands shaking. The handwriting was manic, a spidery scrawl that seemed to leap off the page. It was the journal of Dr. Alistair Finch. It detailed his experiments, his twisted belief that fear and pain could open a door to a new dimension, a place beyond. He wrote of his last experiment, a breakthrough he called the 13th door, a ritual that required a specific kind of spiritual resonance, a person who could see the residuals, a person who could feel the pain of others, a person just like Elias. The journal went on to describe the final, terrifying ritual, the moment when Finch would open the door and walk through. The last entry was a single, simple sentence. I am going home. Aris dropped the journal as if it were on fire. He turned, and he saw it. The wall behind the desk had been sealed with brick, but the bricks were old. And in a space in the middle, in the crumbling mortar, was a faint outline, a footprint, a single distinct footprint of a man's shoe. He knelt down, his mind screaming in denial. The footprint wasn't a fossil. It was fresh. The mortar was still damp around it. He traced the outline with a trembling finger. And then he saw the words scrawled into the wall beside the footprint. Not with a pen or pencil, but with something sharp, something like a fingernail. The 13th is here. Aris felt a cold rush of air, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. He felt it on the back of his neck, a terrible, palpable presence. He knew he was not alone. The being that had once been Dr. Finch was here. It had not vanished, it had simply gone through the door. It was a spirit, a malevolent presence that fed on the suffering in this place. And it had found a new vessel, a new partner in Elias. Elias Vance was never found. The police, when the roads finally cleared, were baffled. They assumed he had simply run off into the blizzard and perished. The case was closed, filed away as an unsolved disappearance. But Aris Thorne stayed at the sanatorium. He couldn't leave. He felt a responsibility to what had happened. To Elias, he moved his office to the south wing, to the very room where Dr. Finch had performed his terrible experiments. And every night, when the light began to fade, he would sit at the old desk and he would feel the sadness, the fear, the desperation of the patients who had suffered here. He felt the echo of their last moments, and he knew with a terrible certainty that Elias Vance hadn't vanished. He had walked willingly into a different realm, a different existence, a spiritual war with a monster that had been waiting for a new challenger. And now Aris Thorne was the one who could see the echoes. He could feel the pain, the terror. He had become Patient 13. And he knew, as he felt the old, cold presence of Dr. Finch's spirit press in on him, that his time was coming. The 13th was here. Ancient Rituals of Appalachian Tribes. This is a story about a place, an old mountain community, and a ritual that should have stayed buried. It's a story about a young man who thought he was a tourist, but found he was a sacrifice. It's a story that asks a chilling question. What happens when you disturb a secret that has been protected for generations? His name was Ethan Reed. A 23-year-old student from Nashville, he was an avid hiker and history buff. He was on a solo road trip through the Appalachian Mountains, drawn by the rugged beauty and the promise of ancient, unspoiled trails. He was the kind of person who loved the idea of getting off the beaten path, finding the hidden gems, the places the guidebooks never mention. He had found a small, isolated community on an old, hand-drawn map in a dusty antique shop in a roadside town. It was just a cluster of faded lines and a single word scrawled in an old hand. Shadow Ridge. Ethan saw it as an adventure, a chance to see a part of the world untouched by modern life. What he didn't know was that some places are untouched for a reason. The journey to Shadow Ridge was a long one. The paved road gave way to a rough gravel track, and then to a barely visible pair of ruts carved into the dense forest floor. The trees were old, their branches gnarled and twisted, their leaves so thick they blocked out the sun, plunging the road into a perpetual dim twilight. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth, and something else, something that smelled like old bones and burning leaves. The GPS signal had disappeared miles ago, and Ethan was completely reliant on the old map. He passed no one, saw no other cars. The silence was absolute, a profound, heavy stillness that was more unnerving than any noise. As he drove deeper, the trees began to take on strange, unnatural shapes. He saw totems carved from ancient wood, their faces grotesque and contorted, their eyes painted with a dark red pigment. They were placed at irregular intervals, silent sentinels watching his progress. He felt a flicker of unease, a cold knot in his stomach. This wasn't just a quirky rural town. This was something else. He was about to turn back when he saw the break in the trees. In the first of the houses, Shadow Ridge was not a town, but a collection of a dozen or so dilapidated wooden cabins clustered together in a small clearing. They looked ancient, their windows dark and empty, their roofs sagging. A faint haze of wood smoke hung in the air, and he could see a few figures moving in the gloom. They were all silent. They simply watched him as he drove past, their faces gaunt, their eyes deep-set and unblinking. The feeling of unease intensified, turning into a prickle of fear on the back of his neck. He pulled up to the only building that looked like a general store. It was little more than a shed with a small, rickety porch. An old man sat on the porch, whittling a small piece of wood. His name was Jason, and his face was a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes a pale, watery blue. When Ethan asked him about the town, about the history, Jason just smiled, a thin, unnerving line on his lips. "We don't get many visitors here, boy," Jason said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "This ain't a place for outsiders. We keep to ourselves. We have our ways." Ethan, trying to keep his composure, asked about a place to stay the night. Jason just pointed a gnarled finger to a cabin at the edge of the clearing. "You can stay there, just one night. You'll want to be gone before the sun sets tomorrow." The warning was delivered with such a calm, matter-of-fact tone that it was more chilling than any threat. Ethan went to the cabin. It was cold and smelled of damp earth and old rot. He unrolled his sleeping bag, feeling a profound sense of isolation and dread. He kept telling himself it was just a strange town, a place with its own customs. He wasn't in any danger. He would just stay the night and leave in the morning. But as the sun began to set, a different sound filled the air. It wasn't human. It was a low, mournful chant, a repetitive, guttural sound that seemed to come from all directions at once. He went to the window and peered out. The townspeople were gathering in the center of the clearing around a large bonfire. They were all wearing long, dark robes, their faces hidden in the shadows. They held strange objects in their hands, pieces of twisted wood and bone. The chant grew louder, a chilling, rhythmic sound that seemed to reverberate in his very bones. A large, stooped man, a priest or a leader, stood at the head of the group, his arms raised to the heavens. Ethan saw the flickering light of the bonfire reflecting off something in his hands. It was a large obsidian blade, its edge gleaming wickedly. He knew then, with a terrible, gut-wrenching certainty, that he had stumbled into a place of ritual. Not a historical reenactment, but a real, living, terrifying ceremony. The chant seemed to be getting closer to his cabin, and he could feel a change in the air, a drop in the temperature, a prickling sensation on his skin. He felt a deep, profound sense of panic. He had to get out. Now. He packed his things in a frenzy, his hands shaking so badly he could barely zip his bag. He threw his things into the car and started the engine. The sound was a roar in the silent night, a beacon of his fear. He put the car in reverse and floored the gas. He tore out of the clearing, the blinding headlights cutting through the oppressive darkness. The trees became a blur of black and green as he sped back down the rough, winding road. He saw the totems he had passed on the way in, their grotesque faces now seeming to leer at him from the shadows. He felt a sense of relief, a fragile hope that he was escaping. He wasn't. The car suddenly stopped. The engine sputtered, then died. He tried to turn the key, but it was useless. The engine was completely dead. He tried the lights, the radio, the windows. Nothing. The car was a silent, useless lump of metal. He was completely alone in the middle of a forest that felt alive and hostile. And then he heard the chant again. It was closer this time, a sound that seemed to be coming from the trees around him, a chorus of voices that were not quite human. He could see them now, faint, shadowy figures moving through the forest, their eyes gleaming like embers in the darkness. They were coming for him. He got out of the car and ran. He ran as fast as he could, his lungs burning, his feet stumbling over the roots and rocks. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to get away from the chant, from the figures in the woods, from the profound and unholy evil that had settled on this place. He ran until he collapsed, his body shaking with exhaustion and terror. He lay there for a long time, listening. The chant was gone. The figures were gone. The silence had returned, but it was a different silence now. It was a silence that felt heavy with expectation. He stood up, his body aching, and looked around. The moon was a pale, anemic sliver in the sky, casting a faint spectral light through the leaves. He was standing in a small, circular clearing. In the center of the clearing was a large, flat stone, its surface stained with what looked like old, dried blood. Surrounding the stone were more of the carved totems, their faces even more terrifying in the moonlight. He felt a cold dread as he looked at them. Their eyes seemed to follow him. He looked down, and he saw it. Carved into the surface of the stone was a single ancient symbol. It was a spiral, a circle with lines radiating out from the center. He had seen it before, on a piece of jewelry in a museum exhibit on ancient rituals. It was a symbol for the return to the center, a symbol of sacrifice. He knew what this place was. He was in the center of the ritual site. He had walked right into it, a willing sacrifice. He turned and saw them. The townspeople were standing at the edge of the clearing, their faces still hidden in the shadows of their robes. They were holding their twisted pieces of wood and bone, their hands held out, their fingers twitching. They were not chanting, they were waiting. The large, stooped man from the bonfire was there too, the obsidian blade now gleaming in his hand. Jason. Jason stepped forward, his pale, watery eyes fixed on Ethan. "You came here, boy," he said, his voice a low, hollow whisper. "You found the path. You found the center. The spirits are pleased. The land is hungry. It has been a long time." Ethan stumbled backward, his mind a whirlwind of terror. "No," he said, his voice a pathetic croak. "No, I'm a hiker, a tourist. This is a mistake." Jason just smiled. "There are no mistakes here, boy, only destiny. We found you. The old ones told us you were coming. They told us the land was ready for its next gift." He raised the obsidian blade. "It's a great honor. Your spirit will join with the land, with the forest, with the old ones. It is the highest honor we can bestow." Ethan turned and ran, but he was no match for them. An implacable wall of robed figures. They wrong and dragged him to the center of the clearing, to the stone. He fought, he screamed, but his voice was a weak, pathetic sound in the silent woods. Stone, his back pressed against the old, dried blood. He looked up at the sky, at the pale sliver of the moon, and then he saw the faces black and empty, their faces gaunt and inhuman. They were things. Jason raised the blade. The clearing seemed to pulse with a faint red light. The ground beneath him seemed to vibrate, a low, constant hum that seemed to come from. He closed his eyes, and he felt a cold, wet sensation on his. He felt a searing, unbelievable pain. Steam tore from his throat. And then he felt sensation, as if a part of him was being sucked out of his body. He felt his memories, his fears, his hopes, his very consciousness, a thin stream of light. He felt himself becoming. The last thing he saw, the last thing he felt, was the look of sublime, ecstatic joy. He felt his essence, his being absorbed into the very stone he lay upon, into the very earth. He had become a part of the forest, a part of the ritual. His body was found 2 days later by a pair of hunters a few miles from his car. It was untouched, perfectly preserved, but his eyes were wide open, and they were empty. The hunters saw nothing unusual about the town. They saw no robed figures, no totems, just a quiet, isolated